So, with the release of A Complete Unknown, there has been a lot of discourse swirling around. Of course, you have the conversations about Bob Dylan and his legacy that I think the film is intended to provoke. People, assessing his character, his music, all these kinds of things, with a renewed focus, with the movie kind of bringing him to the spotlight for a newer generation that maybe hasn't gotten a chance to explore Bob Dylan's life or music as much as people have historically. I find myself as one of them, as someone who, had definitely heard some Bob Dylan songs, but hadn't really learned much about his life before watching this, and I still don't know a whole lot about it. The movie, of course, only gives a small snapshot of it. Then, of course, you have Timothée Chalamet, who is now a super movie star, perhaps one of the biggest names out there, and his performance in this movie, as well as just his general press tour and increased presence in the public eye that this movie is one small part of. And, of course, just the broader conversations about whether we should be focusing on the political or personal parts of Bob Dylan's life, or just try to enjoy his art or enjoy the art that is this movie without worrying about all of that stuff. So with all these various things swirling around in the air, I had a lot that I had on my own mind that I kind of just wanted to get out there. So here's this video, which is just kind of a collection of my thoughts on the various discourses and various items of this movie. To start off with, I just wanted to kind of give my overall review of the movie. I think it's a very good movie. I think a lot of music biopics, or at least like the format of a music biopic, has some potential for weakness, because if you're just going like in a chronological order and telling the events of someone famous's life, it runs the risk of kind of becoming boring, because you're just kind of doing what like the Wikipedia entry of their life would be. You're not actually telling a compelling narrative because you're zoomed out so much. And I think, some films obviously try to zoom in a little bit more in order to prevent this from happening. I think the best music biopics are all ones that do this. And this movie definitely does zoom in on one aspect of Bob Dylan's life, which is basically his rise to stardom up until the point where he goes electric and kind of breaks with the folk scene a little bit. So I do want to give the caveat that I'm not an expert on that area of history or Bob Dylan or folk music or anything like that. So I'm not really coming at this from a place of expertise in that regard, but more just a place of someone who is kind of newly fascinated by this period of history in certain ways that I think most people are talking about, and a few ways that I think I haven't heard as much conversation surrounding, which doesn't mean it's not, people aren't making these same observations, but just something that I kind of wanted to put out there. So alongside just like generally enjoying this movie, I also think that a really standout part of it is the performances. I think, of course, Timothée Chalamet does a great job as Bob Dylan, but I think the supporting cast also does a really good job, whether that be Ed Norton as Pete Seeger, Monica Barbero as Joan Baez, or Elle Fanning as Sylvie Russo, who is actually a fictional character, as we'll get into a little bit later, but based on a real person. And I think that all comes together to kind of make a very compelling film. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but I do think that it does a lot better job than I think a lot of people were expecting, at least maybe a year ago. I think that when this movie was first announced with Timothée Chalamet as the lead actor, there was a somewhat healthy dose of skepticism around it. I think maybe just some people who are Timothée Chalamet haters were like, oh, this isn't a good role for him. And, he's playing Bob Dylan. The guy who's doing Wonka is trying to take this like massive icon and, personify him on screen. Like, I think there was some skepticism around that. And I myself was a little unsure if this was going to work out. But I think it's fair to say that it has been a success. I'm not sure of the commercial numbers off the top of my head. But it seems like the reception has been pretty positive across the board. And for Timothée Chalamet, this is certainly a massive success. I mean, this whole year has been. He had Dune 2, then you had the like viral social media phenomena, starting with the Timothée Chalamet lookalike contest, which I think is perhaps best exemplified by, the perspective of the superfan Club Chalamet account, which was like, posting about how there's no way Timothée Chalamet ever is going to show up to this thing. Like, this is just kind of a lame thing they're putting on. And then Timothée did show up, which kind of made it into this massive phenomenon that was replicated nowhere near successfully as the original one, but countless times across the country. and probably some international instances as well of these lookalike contests, which kind of became sort of the pop culture, part of the pop culture zeitgeist in the build-up to this movie, which wasn't necessarily perceived as part of the build-up to this movie, but it was part of bringing Timothée Chalamet's presence in the media to the forefront in the build-up to this film's release towards the end of the year. And of course, that also accompanied a more explicit promotional press tour with Timothée Chalamet going on tons of mainstream media outlets, but also just random ass podcasts like Theo Von, or being interviewed by Nardwar, or countless other independent, more independent, I guess. And honestly, it seems like those have gone pretty much universally well for him. People seem to like his personality. He seems like a kind of chill, pretty, normal as you can be with being that famous of a person. And I think it's definitely been interesting to see his status as this kind of pop culture icon really cemented, even more so in this year, which, it's hard to even imagine that given how popular and famous he already was, but this has definitely kind of just brought that more to the forefront. Okay, so for the rest of this, I'm going to break down a few parts of the movie, or a few elements of it, in more detail, and so I guess I'll give a spoiler warning. I mean, this is based on real-life events, so, it kind of happened as many decades ago, so I don't know if I need to put up a spoiler warning, but hey, if you haven't seen the movie yet, you might be better off watching the movie before you watch the rest of this, but honestly, I don't think spoilers are going to really change that much for you if you have a bare bones understanding of history. The movie kind of goes where you'd expect it to go in that regard. So one part of the movie that I want to talk about, which has been the source of plenty of discourse, is of course Bob Dylan's relationships with two different women primarily, who are very important parts of this movie and very important parts of the way it tells his life story in this period of time. And frankly, I can't describe the reaction to these characters and his relationships with them as any other way than people just thinking Bob Dylan is a dick and he's an asshole to these women. The first of which is Sylvie Rousseau, who, like I said, is actually a fictional character. She's based on a real person, but the real life Bob Dylan asked for her to be anonymized in this movie because of the, respecting the privacy and wishes of the real person it is based on, which I think, is kind of a classy move, which actually makes him come off as less of a dick than he's portrayed in this movie. But I'm sure the things are a little bit more complicated than just he's a classy guy or he's a dick, obviously. And in the movie, he kind of gets what he deserves in reaction to this. I don't think people's reaction to this is particularly a controversial take. I think it's kind of the intended reading of the movie, with Sylvie Rousseau leaving him towards the end of the movie. And the other main relationship that he has, romantic relationship that he has, is with Joan Baez, who is another folk singer, and she, helps him with his career. They have this, romance that is very much connected to their work in music together as well. But by the end of it, he no longer really wants to work with her musically. He's kind of moved on and doesn't really care about these folk songs anymore, and that also is a major cause of the downfall of their relationship as well. So Joan is the more musically connected person that he is dating in the film, whereas Sylvie Rousseau is actually much more relevant for his political connections, which is also a major, sub-theme of the movie. It's not necessarily the main part of the movie is about Bob Dylan's political activity, or however you want to describe it, but it is definitely an underlying component of it. And Sylvie Rousseau, just like the real person that she was based on, was a member of CORE. CORE, if you don't know, is the Congress of Racial Equality, which was an interracial organization fighting for racial equality in the United States. And it was, a proponent of direct action in many of the, actions taken by the civil rights movement in the 1960s and beyond that, of course. So Sylvie's role in the movie is not just to be a romantic partner on and off with Bob Dylan, but also to be someone who is politically influential on him. And that's something I'll get to a little bit more later when we talk about the political discourse around Bob Dylan and whether this movie is, leaving something out, or whether there's some issues with how it represents him politically, which I think is another interesting conversation that's come out of all of this. But to go back to his relationship with Joan and his connection with folk music, I think that is actually the kind of core conflict in this movie that it's trying to emphasize the most. It is based on a book called Going Electric or something like that, which is about Bob Dylan's, relationship with folk music and his move past it as he becomes a superstar and embraces other kinds of music. And in the end, he decides to play the electric guitar and at the folk festival, and everyone, well, a lot of people hate it, the folk diehards hate it, but of course he finds popular success with this sound as well. And I think that's an interesting tension in this film. The most clear, theme is kind of between creative freedom and preserving a tradition, which has some value to people. I mean, obviously, both of those things are kind of things that many people find value in, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, certainly creative freedom is something that pretty much everyone agrees is a good thing, for the most part. And then preserving a tradition maybe is a little bit more complicated, depends on what that tradition is. But just in terms of folk music as a tradition, I don't think many people have a problem with there being events that celebrate folk music and for people to be interested in it. I certainly don't think that's a bad thing in and of itself. The only question comes when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Are you going to let someone who maybe isn't going to play your idea of folk music play at a folk festival? Do you want to embrace these more alternative sounds, or do you want to stick to the historical tradition that has generally been part of folk music? I think that's kind of the core of this movie, and I think the movie kind of avoids taking a side to some extent. Obviously, Bob Dylan is the protagonist, and he decides to break with this tradition. But I do think that the people on the other side of that, you have Pete Seeger, for example, who we'll talk a little bit more about later in terms of his political nature. But I think that as a musician, he's portrayed pretty favorably as someone who is kind and well-intentioned and cares really about the folk music tradition for good reasons, it seems like, and is trying to be gentle with Bob Dylan in terms of helping him be a part of this and allowing him to do his own thing, but saying, hey, at the folk festival, can you play folk music? He is, portrayed, I would say, pretty favorably. Now, there are other people who are part of the folk music community, Alan Lomax, I believe, being the main example of them, who do come off a little bit more as hostile, antagonistic towards Bob Dylan, who maybe aren't portrayed in as favorable a light, depending on your interpretation of this whole conflict. But I also think there's people on Bob Dylan's side who are kind of antagonistic towards the folk music in kind of like a punk or proto-punk kind of way. They just kind of want to reject all these norms and traditions, and I think both of those kind of play a pretty balanced role in the way the film presents it, which I think is an interesting way to frame this, because you could have very easily seen a film that essentially says, screw all this old stuff. Bob Dylan, he's the truth. He's the real one who knows what's going on. And, we shouldn't care about this. But I don't think it was disrespectful in that way to the folk tradition. I think Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, who, takes less of a role as his health, worsens over the course of the film. I think they're both portrayed pretty favorably. And I don't think there's this kind of antagonistic attitude from the movie as a whole towards folk music, even if a few characters maybe are portrayed that way. And this is where I think this kind of connects back to the political elements of the film, because I think that the folk music versus new other music conflict is also a political conflict in some sense, in the sense that the figures involved had different politics that they embraced. And I think that is another interesting part of this conversation. And I think that's one thing that I have seen criticism of the movie not talking about as much. That's not to say that the movie ignores politics. It certainly doesn't. They mentioned the Vietnam War a number of times, and they mentioned anti-racism and the struggle for racial equality, obviously with Sylvie Russo's character, but also Bob Dylan's involvement in that, him speaking at the march, or him performing at the March on Washington and things like that. They're not ignored in the film, but they aren't necessarily the central conflict of the film either. I think an interesting perspective on this was Boots Riley, who is a left-wing musician and director and producer of films, who had some things to say about the political nature of this and, Bob Dylan as a whole, which I kind of wanted to use as a jumping off point for this conversation. So he starts off this tweet by saying that he loved The Complete Unknown, the performances were amazing, which I definitely agree with, but he argues that it left out an important tension between Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan that was political and not just about the aesthetics of the music. He says he doesn't mind and that it will bring people to the music either way, but this was something that could have been elaborated on more. And he cites a quote from Noam Chomsky, which is critical of Bob Dylan's politics. One part of this that I think is probably the most important is that Chomsky argues that Bob Dylan said over and over again that he'd been through all this protest thing, realized it was nonsense, and that the only thing that was important was to live his own life happily and freely, not to mess around with other people's lives by working for civil rights, ending war and poverty, that kind of thing. I think this is interesting because it kind of reflects back onto the conflict of the film in a new light, where Bob Dylan's embrace of this alternative sound is also maybe connected to his philosophy in life changing, where he doesn't really want to focus on this, folk tradition, which included a lot of very left-wing political elements, and he mostly just wants to kind of embody a individualistic political perspective about kind of just letting everyone live their own lives and do their own thing, which I think is a theme that does come through in the movie a little bit as well. As Boots Riley's put it, Bob Dylan didn't become apolitical. His politics changed many times. He's a complicated person, but always a brilliant songwriter. And Boots Riley says that part of learning from Bob Dylan was his own decision not to limit himself to artistry and be more explicitly political, is at least how I'm understanding this. Which I think is an interesting criticism in saying that Bob Dylan basically decided that his art, his music, was more important than his political sympathies, and also those political sympathies, of course, changed over time. Another element of this that he brings up is the lack of clarification about the politics of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, which is that they were basically communists. And they intended to use their music explicitly to advocate for their political beliefs. I mean, there's so many songs, by Pete Seeger, by Guthrie, that are very explicitly about labor unions, capitalism, the war. This is like kind of the core of their music in many ways. And I think that while that's something the movie doesn't dispute that reality, it doesn't necessarily embrace or emphasize it a huge amount, which I think is interesting. It's not like it is ignored. You see the guitar with "This Machine Kills Fascists" on it, and you see various other allusions to political sympathies, but it isn't something that is thrown in your face so much in the movie. And if you didn't know that going in, you might not have connected all the dots going out. I know that as someone who, had that information going into the movie, and that's something I was looking for, I didn't see it in a lot of parts of the movie that I thought maybe it would have been brought up in. I guess the one main exception to this is probably like early on in the movie when you see Pete Seeger's court case being played out and that people are arguing that he's un-American or unpatriotic, which still could have been elaborated on more, like what his actual politics were, but I think that, or his, connections to like socialists and communists and stuff like that. But instead they portrayed him sympathetically, but they didn't necessarily get into the details of his political beliefs. And as someone who's personally interested in the history of socialism and communism as a topic, I love when that content is covered in media, and I would have loved to see this movie explore that more. But I also recognize that that's not necessarily what every movie wants to do, and that's okay. That doesn't make it a bad piece of art. It just means it's not perfectly tailored to my interests, which is fine. A movie that I think did this in an interesting way, for example, that actually was a little bit more explicit about connections with communism was Oppenheimer, which talked about how Oppenheimer had connections, or was at least adjacent to the Communist Party at various points in time before he ascended to the heights of the Manhattan Project. And I think that movie did so in an interesting way, and did kind of embrace the socialist communist, connections that he purportedly had as a central element and conflict within the film, which I found really fascinating personally. And I think Boots Riley generally seems to be on the same page as me in terms of how I articulated that, this would have been something that I would have liked to see, and it would have been maybe a more interesting political message or history that the movie would be telling. However, it doesn't mean it's a bad movie. It's still a good movie. The performances are still good. It doesn't necessarily negate any of those other things, but it is just kind of some other interesting angles that could have been talked about more in the movie, or that, I think it's worth knowing about if you're going to be interested in this era and some of these the historical figures and musicians as well. And I think another aspect of this that I found fascinating is the way, I think the way that the movie presents Bob Dylan, and the way that they avoid some of the political elements of his life, or the way that they may de-emphasize a little bit the political elements of his life, is through instead focusing primarily on him as a like socio-cultural figure, like as a cultural icon and a growing pop star, which I think makes a whole lot of sense, honestly. And I think that the interesting part of that to me is the way in which that was still connected to politics in the time. You know, Bob Dylan was in large part, part of his popularity was connected to his, being part of a political counterculture and connected to the civil rights movement and all these things. Like, those were very intrinsically tied in with his public image in a way that I think is really not as present as much in the modern day, which I thought was an interesting thing to reflect on when I was watching this movie. I was thinking about, like, do we have a Bob Dylan of the modern era? Someone who, whether their political sympathies, changed over time, at one point in time was seen as this musical embodiment of a political movement in such a meaningful way. And the only really example I could think of is probably Kendrick Lamar, who I think has been connected to a lot of recent struggles against like police brutality and racism in the United States. And I think an interesting parallel there is too that Kendrick Lamar and Bob Dylan are some of the musicians who have also won like Pulitzer Prizes and have been like very much embraced by elements of the mainstream in interesting ways, in the way that they've been legitimized. Now, that came later in Bob Dylan's life, not while he was part of this countercultural movement. But I think that in terms of the Pulitzer specifically, obviously he was embraced in many ways during that time. But I think that that's kind of an interesting comparison to make. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who's made such an observation, but I do think it's interesting to think about why there may not be as many prominent musicians or just pop culture figures in general that are more connected to politics as much. Obviously, celebrities make political endorsements all the time, but usually it doesn't go beyond that too much for a lot of huge celebrities, and it kind of just stays within the realm of, oh, this person supports the Democrats, this person supports the Republicans, maybe this one issue or another that they advocate about, but there isn't this kind of like massive cultural moment where someone is defined by their connection to a movement, at least as much. I think Kendrick is really the only example that I can think of, and even then, I think that he very much transcends that. And you could say the same thing about Bob Dylan, but I think that conversation is really part of why I wanted to make this video, and something that I thought I wanted to, explore more. And I'm really interested to hear if other people disagree with me or have examples that they can think of, massively successful media figures that are very political in their public, image, and people think of them. They don't just think of their music and their art. They think of the political movement behind them. Because I think that if you look at Bob Dylan, if you look at Pete Seeger, if you look at Woody Guthrie, which obviously achieved differing levels of fame, but were all, pretty relevant musical figures in their time, all of them were in some way or another defined by their politics in various times of their lives. And I think that that's something that this movie reminded me of and made me think more about why maybe today is different. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And if you have any other disagreements about what I'm saying, or things that you think were important elements of this movie, or some things that were discussed in the aftermath of this movie that you think I didn't cover, I'd love to hear that as well. So thank you for watching this. I hope you enjoyed me just kind of ranting about this movie for a little few minutes. And I hope you enjoyed the movie if you watched it too. I think it was a great time, and I, have a lot of thoughts on it, obviously. So here I am. But yeah, that's all for me today. So bye-bye.